Look, it's not a true open world. I'll give you that. It's structured almost like a Far Cry game, with 3 large areas walled off by progression checkpoints. But other than that, this really feels the way I remember Oblivion the first time I played it. Not the way Oblivion actually is, as I realized when I played the remaster last year, but the way it felt. Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, is a loose retelling of Arthurian legend, filtered through a Kickstarter-backed board game from a Polish fantasy author. I didn't know about the board game aspect until it was mentioned in the final credits. The game developer, Questline, seems to be a subsidiary of Awaken Realms, the board game distributor. I wonder if they're trying to pull a Games Workshop. This game, released 2025, had some success but was in tight competition with 2 well-funded and similar first-person medieval adventure games, namely Kingdom Come II and Avowed, which released in close proximity. Not to mention Clair Obscur, which was really hitting its popularity around the time Tainted Grail released. 2025 was a year of stupidly long mainstream games. Tainted Grail ran me about 60 hours, and I am probably not the only person who played just a few of these because there's just not enough time. A man's gotta work to eat. Grail fits into that niche that people seem to be calling AA games nowadays, but 10 years ago we'd be calling this Eurojank, or Euroyonk. Although very high-end Eurojank. It's not an incredibly smooth experience, reminding me a bit more of a Stalker than a Fallout. Lots of unpolished edges and odd production value choices, but with some very intriguing ideas. There's also some amount of AI-generated text and assets here, apparently. Personally, I'm not incredibly familiar with or watchful of AI, so I didn't really register the apparent obvious red flags as anything other than kind of odd images and unexpectedly flat and bad writing. I'm not sure how much of the dialogue or story are wholesale AI, or if parts are purely translation issues, being that this is a Polish studio. There are bits when characters seem to change demeanor and tone on a dime, but, well, that's not exactly uncommon in games, especially in games where choices lead to divergent paths. The studio didn't really disclose what all was generative AI, so there's lots of speculation ranging from simple background decorations to basically everything. Personally, I prefer the old-school human-crafted weirdness as opposed to the modern machine-made weirdness. Well, anyways, let's get into the actual game. 500-ish years ago, the continent was at its brink due to the Red Death Plague, a super zombie virus, which caused King Arthur to rally his men and lead a mass exodus to the island of Avalon, where he founded Camelot, with a K, and waged war against the mysterious Forebearers who resided there. There's also some giants and a permeating new sphere's force called the Weirdness to contend with. In present tense, we awaken in the Asylum for Red Death Victims, where we are rescued by the Knight Caradoc in a very generic prison break opening that feels like 100 other games. As we escape from the asylum, we have our first encounters with 2 forces. One, the immortal spirit of King Arthur, which cures our sickness, hides out in our body, and gives us a neat little bullet time ability. And the menhirs, massive 4-armed statues that repel the weirdness and allow humans to live in relative peace within a certain limit. The spirit of Arthur helps us make our escape, and Caradoc immediately reveals that his motivation is to guide the player into resurrecting Arthur so he can finally kill him. As we progress, we learn a little more about the world. That Camelot has grown bureaucratic and corrupt, the menhirs are failing and towns are being wiped out, and that Arthur is being resurrected every 100 years or so to try to fix everything, sort of a golden bullet for all civilizational ills. Of course, the world is pretty much on the edge of ruin, so it must not be working too well. Grail is clearly aping the Elder Scrolls, mixing in with Dark Souls and a hint of Witcher 3. We have essentially a sprawling action RPG with near-standard Bethesda combat, including perk trees and a skill-based leveling system, albeit slightly improved by having skill level ups and kills give experience towards your main level, allowing for a little bit more experimentation. It's also adding in a limited-use dash for dodging, and a parry timing window straight from a Souls game. Visually, it's taking a lot of Dark Souls, medieval splendor, and ruin, and jamming that in with some interesting, gribbly HR Geiger elements. There's enough reference points here to basically make something that feels fresh. The Horns of the South is our first exploration zone, where we're off to recover a shard of Arthur's soul from Excalibur. This area is the best part of the game. It feels the best to explore, since the game is still fresh. Little caves and dungeons with great verticality and a really surprising amount of hidden paths, quests, bosses, and treasures. Learning the ins and outs of the cooking and crafting system, the discovery phase of this game is just really great. It's also the only point in the game where you can really mix and match tactics. Past the first zone, you'll most likely have to specialize in one combat type. This is a weirdly common failing with RPGs, especially ones with perk trees, where as you advance, the game gives you less and less options as a byproduct of needing to focus all your stats on using one weapon well. But in the beginning it's great, switching to a bow to kite something, dabbling with magic, really feeling out the options with debuffs and trying to sound out a personal style. Equipment has really interesting modifiers that inform your build as much as stats. And you can always respec at almost any time if you want to focus on a different tactic. But, well, that always feels weirdly like a betrayal of my character's evolution and an abrupt change to their story. Personally, I rarely respec characters in anything other than MMOs, but that's a preference. The balancing here is also kind of slipshod, but usually in a pro-player power way. You can find tokens that make your next stealth attack a guaranteed one-hit kill. Or early on, a spell that explodes an enemy into a pile of cheese. Lots of options to completely bypass challenging enemies if needed. I played as a pure melee two-hander build for most of the game, on the harder difficulty, and it led to a uneven experience. In the back half of each zone, it was kind of boring. Everything died as soon as I looked at it. And then the front half of the next zone would be intense, constant, parry and riposte duels that were fairly predictable, but long-lasting, until clearing the zone gradually resolved back into one-hit kills. Some enemies scale, some don't, which just makes the challenge somewhat uneven. The combat is more interesting than Skyrim or Oblivion by virtue of the dodge and parry options, but this game does seem to think challenge derives from giving an enemy way more health or a simple one-hit kill ability. And even then, I was still one-shotting everything for a large portion of my playthrough. I didn't even really try to optimize my build in any way, just picked feats in the moment and equipped gear that suited me. The exploration in this game is dynamite, because the dungeons are typically bespoke and distinct, despite often sharing design elements. Loads of hidden passages, vertical spaces, sprawling catwalks, and a fair amount of self-contained quests to be worked out, or a bit of environmental storytelling to keep things interesting. The variety of unique equipment, alongside the ever-present hunt for crafting and cooking supplies, kept me looking out for those little loot stashes hidden all over every dungeon. Just a really, really pleasant exploration experience here. Another interesting addition to the formula are these shrines. Dotted around the map, when you find them and offer an appropriate item, they'll provide permanent boosts to your stats. Sometimes small, sometimes more meaningful. And this often developed into an emergent hunt for whatever creature's skin I needed before I forgot where the shrine was. And it provides a nice cumulative reward for exploration that carries across the entire game. I've always been a huge fan of player choices providing long-term perks beyond the scope of skill trees and typical character building, and this is an interesting minor twist on that. I did notice some weirdness with the graphics and art design. Well, mostly the animations. There's very jittery animations in play, especially with the melee executions, which don't seem to correctly lock in on the enemy, despite requiring very precise positioning directly in front of them. Cutscenes often have this bizarrely fast fade in or out that makes them feel stilted and unnatural, like they're paced wrong by about 30 seconds on both ends. The actual textures are usually pretty nice, and there's a load of interesting looking equipment to be found, although I greatly preferred the early game realistic late medieval gear to the later game, let's say anime Viking gear. that might not be right. A lot of the late game equipment looks like it's from World of Warcraft raids, which does feel bizarre compared to the otherwise bleak and semi-realistic nature of the game world. The real standout designs are largely related to King Arthur and the other beings touched by the weirdness. Unfortunately, there aren't as many of these as I was hoping, but on the other hand, the more conservative use of those bonkers designs does make them feel uniquely alien to the world when they do show up. I think the storytelling kind of stumbles overall. There's 3 big choices in this game. Essentially, each time it's a choice of who to support. A scrappy faction of locals, or forces from the unvisited Camelot, with a K. Embracing change or clinging to an old legend. But Camelot is painted as pretty useless right off the bat, and your first encounter with an actual Camelot representative is a dude actively burning several of his own troops alive. It seems like it was trying to go for more of a shades of gray, complicated morality thing, but to me it felt that Camelot wasn't really painted as morally gray, rather it was an obviously malfunctioning bureaucracy bordering on tyranny. Although, this does seem like an echoing of your constant companion, the ghost of King Arthur. Throughout the game he chimes in about the role of myth-making and his own actions in the distant past. He's a pretty standard dictator who always insists the terrible decisions he made were things he had to do to win the war, and all that. Sometimes he's likable, sometimes he's obviously deluding himself, and sometimes it feels like the writers forgot what personality they wanted to go with. And he becomes weirdly placid and suggestible for an almighty, legendary king. It's possible the writing is actually good enough that I fell for the propaganda, but to me the Camelot route did not seem like a very well-supported option, and more like a gimme thrown in to present the illusion of meaningful choices. I liked a lot of the side quests. There's a good range of comedic asides or interesting twists on fairly standard quest lines. Like a soldier who requests you to make his mother's pie recipe to remind him why he joined up with the army in the first place, and then reveals that he joined up because his mother's cooking was so awful. There's a good bit of intrigue, a nice mix of folklore elements with the fantasy, and ultimately it feels like a continuation of the Elder Scrolls tradition of having the side content be more engaging than the through-line story. And the game is really dense with side quests. Again, sort of a nitpick, but there's actually so many side quests that I kind of dreaded arriving at each new town. It seems like every NPC has their own errand for you to run, and collecting them all when you arrive in a zone is actually somewhat tedious. Although the quests themselves are pretty good. There are some filler point A, point B quests, but generally some nice characterization and world building is involved, even in those. There's also a missable questline at the end that reveals the origin of the Red Death and the weirdness, and it's actually a pretty interesting reveal. Without giving too much away, basically a godlike entity discovers humanity, sees one of us die, and has sort of a reverse Genesis moment when it realizes it too can die. And then everything spiraled out of control. I'm carefully omitting a lot there, but hey, I thought it was a cool twist. Overall, the exploration really carries the game for a solid 40 hours, but this is a 60-hour game at least. The game felt at its best during the beginning, and then it steadily declines towards a comfortable baseline. There were moments when I felt fully immersed, to use a term of art. And just to be clear, when I specifically am talking about immersion, I'm referring to moments when the gameplay flows out in a naturalistic way that aligns in mood with the game itself, when I don't need to do any bizarre gamer moves like wall peeking, exploiting AI, or ruthless dialogue checking. When I can just wander around through a dungeon and see what I find, feeling the rush of discovery that the character themselves would be feeling, when I'm not aware of what buttons I'm pressing to make things happen. In that sense, it succeeds pretty often. There are some jagged edges. A lot of jagged edges, but that core is still there. On the trusty pain scale, I'd give Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, a slightly painful. It's not a perfect game, and it doesn't break the mold in interesting enough ways to really elevate it to the top. But it was definitely an enjoyable experience, and I don't regret my time spent on Avalon. Well, that's all for my 56th review. They're coming a bit slower now, but it's been a busy summer. Huge thanks to everyone who watched this whole video. You're the reason I keep doing it. I'm Jotun Warrior. Thanks for coming around, and as always, see ya.